Let us now look at some of the details of the experimental method. The first thing that we have to understand is that the experiment is a method as well as an approach. It deals with why, that is causal, or how, that is process related questions. The experimental method and approach is distinguished from the correlational approach, in which covariations or linear dependence between two or more variables are studied. It should be kept in mind that correlations do not by themselves indicate causal relationships, but they may provide indications of a possible causal relationship. What is an experiment? The purpose of an experiment is as follows. An attempt is made to identify the cause or causes, namely x or x1, x2, x3, etc., of an event y that has been observed. The x variable is considered to be the cause, also called the antecedent, the independent variable, or the stimulus variable. The y variable is considered to be the effect or the consequence or the dependent variable, and is also sometimes referred to as the response variable. Let us take an example of an experiment that can be potentially conducted in the lab. The question that is to be seen in this example is, what is the effect of success or failure experience on helping behavior? The research question is as follows. In which condition, that is the experience of success or the experience of failure, is there more helping behavior? The hypothesis that the experimenter can possibly propose in this kind of experiment is the possible or expected causal relationship between the independent variable x, namely success failure experience, and the dependent variable y, namely helping behavior. The goal of an experiment is to test hypotheses. A hypothesis in any experiment is formulated on the basis of previous research findings, existing theories, and logical thinking, which is often referred to as the rationale. The hypothesis in our example, to reiterate, would be something like the following. The question was, in which condition the experience of success or the experience of failure is there likely to be more helping behavior? The hypothesis in response to this research question could be, there would be more helping under success than under failure. The rationale for this kind of one-sided expectation is the warm glow of success found in some research studies, and the explanation is that this warm glow of success would put the person in a good mood, a positive mood, and make him or her give more help. Such an experience of the warm glow would not be found in the case of failure. Hence, the level of helping under the failure condition would be likely to be lower than that under the success condition. The next step in the experiment would be operationalization of the variables. As we have already seen, the researcher begins with a question that is conceptual in nature. When casting this conceptual question into the experimental format, it is necessary that the independent and dependent variables be specified in the form in which they will be actually included in the experiment. This is what is referred to as operationalization. In our example, once again, we have success failure as the independent or causal variable, and we would like to see if this leads to helping behavior, and if so, in what form. Let us begin with the operationalization of success and failure. Success could be operationalized as getting above a specified number of marks on a given task. Likewise, failure could be operationalized as getting below a specified number of marks on a given task. The task is part of the experimental procedure. We also have to operationalize the dependent variable, namely helping behavior. In this example, this could be operationalized as the amount of money donated to a charitable organization or a charitable cause. Okay, Manoranjan, you can see this equipment here?
Yes.
This is called the Miller-Lire illusion. Now, what I would like you to do is to move this piece to your right as far as is needed, so that this featherhead line appears exactly equal to this arrowhead line. I will ask you to do 5 trials of this. All right?
Okay.
So you can get started. I'll put this at the start point. Now please keep moving this piece until you think the featherhead line and the arrowhead line are equal, and I will take the reading from behind.
Is there any time limit?
No, not at all. You're not supposed to measure with your hand.
Oh, yes.
You're just supposed to use your eyes. Okay, you want to stop there?
Yes.
Okay. Now the second trial, please. Up here. Okay, now can move. Okay, Manoranjan, I'm happy to tell you that your average performance has been better than that performed by the rest of the subjects, which is considered good performance. Very good indeed. Keep up this good performance, okay? Thank you very much for participating.
Thank you.
एक्सक्यूज़ मी, हम साक्षरता अभियान की तरफ से आए हैं. आप पैसे से हमारी कुछ मदद करना चाहेंगे?
Yes.
Okay, Shubham. Yes. This is called the Miller-Lire illusion. What I would like you to do is to move this piece as far to your right as required, so that this arrowhead line and the featherhead line appear to be equal.
Okay.
Okay, I'll give you 5 trials of this. So you may start now. I will take the reading from behind. Okay. Second trial now. Yes. That's good. Now let me look at your performance on this other task and give you feedback. Okay, Shubham, I'm sorry to give you this information, but your performance has not been satisfactory. It has been lower than what most others have got. I'm sorry about this, and I hope you will do better next time. Thank you very much for participating.
एक्सक्यूज़ मी, हम साक्षरता अभियान की तरफ से आए हैं, आप कुछ पैसे से मदद करना चाहेंगे?
Further, we look at the manipulation of independent variable or variables. Manipulation in the context of the experimental method refers to the presentation of the independent variable to the subjects as planned by the experimenter. Needless to say, manipulation follows the operationalization of the independent variable in the context of the research question and in the context of a specific experiment. That is, there is no general rule about how a particular variable should be or could be manipulated in many different experiments. The main characteristic of the experiment is that there is a created or artificially presented independent variable rather than a naturally occurring variable. This idea is summed up in the whole process called manipulation of the independent variable. That is, the experimenter artificially introduces into the experiment a variable that he or she has hypothesized as being one of the possible causes of the event or dependent variable. It is, however, not sufficient to stop at manipulation. We also need something called a check on the manipulation. This may not be necessary in all experiments, but in many experiments it is indeed important for the experimenter to confirm that the manipulation that has resulted from the artificial creation of the independent variable has in fact resulted in the intended effect. This step is called manipulation check. In our example, success-failure manipulation has to be checked, and this is in order to make sure that subjects in the manipulated success condition did truly experience success, and likewise in the case of failure subjects, they did indeed experience failure. A very important component of the experiment is what is called control. In general, control in the experimental method appears in two forms. Both of these forms are related, but there is a slight difference. A, control can appear in the form of what is called holding constant all variables other than the independent variable of interest in that particular experiment. The second form, B, is, as we understand it, in the form of what is called the control group. Now, what does holding constant mean? As has already been stated, all variables other than the independent variable of interest in that particular experiment have to be kept constant in that sample. This form of control is incorporated usually through random and representative sample selection and also random assignment of subjects to experimental conditions. The idea behind this component called holding constant is simply that all those who are in the experimental group, that is, the group that gets the manipulation, are similar in all other respects to the other group called the control group, which does not get the manipulation. Then, if there is a difference between the two groups, that difference can be logically attributed to the presence of the manipulation. We will see something in addition to this idea in a while. The second meaning of control comes out in the form of the control group. Obviously, this is very closely related to holding constant. The distinction between what is called the experimental group and what is called the control group is that the control group does not receive the manipulation of the independent variable. On the other hand, the experimental group is that which receives the manipulation of the independent variable. Please note that subjects have by rule to be assigned randomly to the experimental and control groups. If random assignment is violated, then there may not be a sound logical ground for assuming that any difference that comes out, if at all, between the experimental and control groups is due to the manipulated independent variable. Rather, it could be due to any other factor. In our example, the experimental groups would be success and failure groups. For the control group, there is more than one possibility. One alternative is to include a third group to which no feedback about performance is given. Thus, there could be a total of 3 groups: the success group, the failure group, and the no feedback group, which can be treated as the control group. Let us raise a more fundamental question. Why is a control group needed at all in the experimental method? The answer to this question is that the experiment tests the x to y causal relationship. It should be seen, therefore, that A, x leads to y, but also that B, not x leads to not y. The x group in this example is the experimental group, and the not x group is the control group. Except for the presence and absence of the independent variable, the two groups should be similar in other respects. It should also be remembered that any of these two groups by itself does not provide a complete answer to the cause-effect question. There could be instances in which one experimental group serves as the comparison or control for the other experimental group. To repeat, in our own example, success and failure groups, although they have been defined as experimental groups, may serve as controls for each other. In other words, we may redefine the success group as that group that does not receive failure experience, and likewise, the failure group can be defined as that group that does not receive success experience. If we introduce the no feedback group, we are in fact also trying to see the example of feedback versus no feedback. To continue our description of the components of the experimental method, we need to look at what is called confounding. Avoiding confounding is an important element in conducting a successful experiment. This means that the independent variable should function in a clear or uncluttered way without including any other unplanned or unwanted variable, often referred to as an extraneous variable. If there are variables other than the ones that are specifically to be studied as the causal variable or variables, the presence of any other unwanted or extraneous variable may lead to incorrect conclusions. What is the source of confounding? It has been found that confounding might enter into the experiment through various routes, such as non-random sample selection, non-random assignment of subjects to different conditions, inappropriate manipulation of the independent variable or variables, experimental expectancy, and demand characteristics. There is no rule that tells us that only one of these can be a source of confounding. So it is a good idea for an experimenter to be cautious about all of these factors and probably some others. A comment on experimenter expectancy is in order. What very frequently happens is that because the experimenter is the one who has proposed a hypothesis, he or she unwittingly and unintentionally does something as part of the procedure that creates a kind of bias in the direction of confirmation of the hypothesis. In addition to the experimenter expectancy effect, subjects sometimes unwittingly introduce a confounding variable through what is called a demand characteristic. That simply means that subjects try to guess what the experimenter would want them to do and accordingly behaves either to satisfy the experimenter or to prove the experimenter wrong. Very clearly, both of these can be sources of confounding and should be avoided. Let us now take a look at what is called the experimental design. Briefly, this refers to or begins with the number of independent and dependent variables included in an experiment. It also includes the number of levels of each independent variable. This means that every independent variable can be divided into more than one form. For example, in our hypothetical experiment on the effect of success failure on helping behavior, the success failure independent variable has two levels. If a third group, namely the control group called no feedback, is included, then it would be said that the independent variable is being taken at 3 levels. One could also have different kinds of variables in terms of whether we have different groups of subjects in each experimental condition and control condition, or whether all the subjects are exposed to all the levels of the independent variables. In this connection, a distinction is made between what is called between subjects designs or within subjects designs. Between subjects designs are those in which subjects are placed in different experimental and control groups. That is, no subject is exposed to more than one condition, and it could in fact be the control group in which a particular subject is placed. By contrast, in the case of a within subjects design, the same subject is exposed to more than one level of the independent variable or perhaps even the control condition. We also could have an experimental design in which some variables are between subjects variables and other variables are within subjects variables. Such experimental designs are called mixed designs, so that the possibility of including both kinds of variables, namely between subjects and within subjects variables, also referred to as repeated measures, exists. One should note that between subjects and within subjects is a description of the independent variables. We have not said anything about the dependent variable. In any experiment, it is always possible to have more than one dependent variable. With the facility that is available now of all kinds of statistical analysis, it is not a problem anymore to think in terms of having more than one dependent variable, as long as it practically fits into the purpose of the experiment. So we take a look now at how data is analyzed statistically in the context of an experiment. We must begin by saying that now, given the sophistication of statistical analysis techniques, any kind of statistical analysis is possible. This aspect of the experimental method is particularly important in what is now called the quantitative approach. The aim of statistical analysis in an experiment is to test the hypothesis and to see whether the predicted effects emerged. The more common statistical technique that is used in the context of the experiment is one that goes with the experimental design, and this is the analysis of variance. We have at least two kinds of analyses of variance, one called univariate analysis of variance or ANOVA, in which there is only one dependent variable. But we could also have multivariate analysis of variance, commonly known as MANOVA, in which the number of dependent variables is greater than 1. The contemporary view of statistical analysis is that it should include some correlational analysis in addition to experimental design analysis. This is because very often independent variables themselves may be related to each other, and the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable may in fact involve a correlational component as well. Very many techniques are now available for us to look at how not just the causal one-way relationship between the independent and dependent variable can be examined, but also how the intervening variables, or what is referred to as the third variable, can be examined quite clearly. What are the positive features or advantages of the experiment? The first point to be made in this regard is that if the major steps and components of the experimental method are followed properly, this method can be rigorous, objective, and helpful in making predictions. In fact, rigor, objectivity, and prediction are three major aims of what is called the scientific approach, and of course the experiment is taken as a major representative of the scientific approach. Depending on the nature of the dependent variable or variables and the appropriateness or novelty of the manipulation of the independent variable or variables, the experiment can turn out to be versatile and could show how the most scientifically minded researcher can end up also being very rigorous and strict in approach. A second positive feature of the experimental method is that it enables the observation of actual behavior as well as stated behavior, sometimes called as if behavior, under controlled condition. What has been found is that a certain amount of variety can be built into the experimental method. However, there are many limitations as well. The major shortcoming of the experimental method is its artificiality. By definition, an experiment is something that is non-natural. Often it is claimed that experimental realism is present in the experiment, but this may be at the cost of what is called mundane realism. This is another way of saying that when an experiment is conducted in the artificial environment of what is called the laboratory, everything that is done within the lab can be very nicely and neatly controlled, aiming at rigor and objectivity. But if the question of applying the findings of such experiments outside the lab is taken up, perhaps what is called worldly or mundane realism is one count on which something is lost. A third limitation that is pointed out, which is related in some sense to the second point, is that if internal validity is maintained through rigor in method, external validity may accordingly get weakened. In other words, every experimenter must make up his or her mind in terms of which aspect is more important for a particular study, whether it is internal validity that will answer the experimenter's questions better, or whether it is external validity that should be maintained. Lastly, the experimental method is very bounded and is constrained only by control conditions. According to many researchers, this does not at all allow the kind of flexibility that a researcher would like to have in examining particular questions of interest. One way of reducing the limitations of the lab experiment is something called field experiments. Such experiments are once again artificially created conditions, but the setting is a natural one. Field experiments succeed in introducing realism into the experimental method to some extent. A combination of a laboratory experiment with a field experiment is also possible. Taking up our example again, a success or failure subject comes out of the lab after receiving performance feedback. As he is going away, a person meets him and asks if he would like to donate for a charitable cause. This person says he is from a group that works for the same cause. Note that the first part of this experiment was conducted in an artificially created setting within the lab. Unknown to the subject, as he or she walks out of the lab, this person who accosts him and asks whether he would like to donate has been instructed to behave in that particular manner. But this second part of the experiment is apparently a natural one. That is, the subject does not know that this component is a part of the same experiment. So this aspect may appear real because in real life also, people working for charitable organizations or other social causes do come to us asking for donations. If and when such deceptions are involved in experiments, subjects have to be debriefed. That is, they have to be told that this component was an enacted feature of the experiment. Much more can be said about the experimental method as such. Some comments will be made as and when the occasion arises. But we move on now to the next method on our list, and that is the psychophysical methods. Conventionally, psychophysical methods have been used in the study of perceptual processes. Psychophysics is that branch of perception which studies the relationship between stimulus characteristics on one hand and perceiver responses on the other. However, psychophysical methods have an extended use in the form of scaling techniques and methods involving judgments. So, in contemporary research for very many years, psychophysical methods have not been restricted only to the study of perceptual processes. Scaling techniques can be used to assess any psychological state. For example, sweetness of a solution, brightness, loudness, heaviness, or even liking for a particular object, issue, person, and so on. With reference to judgment methods, we go back to the earlier psychophysical research days in which 3 psychophysical methods were mentioned specifically, namely the method of limits, the method of constant stimuli, and the method of adjustment. Very often, these 3 methods were compared with each other or even used independently for the study of perceptual processes, such as the degree of illusions. The signal detection approach is yet another example of one kind of judgment method in which some decision has to be made. Basically, this is done by looking at yes or no responses when the signal is actually present and the signal is actually not present. A comparison is made between the probability of hits and the probability of false alarms. In the context of signal detection, a hit is that situation in which the signal or stimulus is actually present and the person says, yes, it is present. A false alarm is that situation in which the perceiver or the subject says, yes, the signal is present, but actually the signal is not present. This approach, namely the signal detection approach, has been used in more than one field in psychology. Both scaling techniques and judgment methods as forms of psychophysical techniques are used in many fields, wherever the nature of the dependent variable lends itself to psychophysical measurement of some kind. A common example of the scaling technique is the use of rating scales, particularly in the field called social psychology. The signal detection approach is commonly found in the study of perception and also of memory. The next method is psychophysiological methods. These methods are employed in order to examine the physiological processes accompanying or underlying psychological processes. The commonly used psychophysiological methods are as follows. Earlier psychosurgical techniques that were highly controversial, such as lobotomy and lobectomy, have been replaced now by neuroimaging techniques such as functional magnetic resonance imaging, commonly called fMRI. Indicators of heart and respiratory rate, muscular activity through electromyography or EMG, electrodermal indications such as the galvanic skin response or GSR, EEG, the electroencephalogram, neural activity in the form of action and evoked potentials, eye-related activities such as pupil size changes and eye movements, as well as eye tracking through pupillometry and electrooculography or EOG, are other examples of commonly used psychophysiological methods. These methods can be used in diverse fields within psychology and also in other areas outside of psychology, such as design. Clearly, these methods are used in order to answer specific research questions in which the neurophysiological processes underlying psychological processes are of interest. If there is no question of any psychological or psychophysiological process in the picture, then of course these methods do not have a place in a particular study. We move on now to psychometric methods. In these methods, the aim is to construct tools such as psychological scales and tests that make it possible to quantitatively assess various psychological processes, including mental states such as attitudes and individual differences in abilities and personality. Psychometric measures and methods provide precision and objectivity to psychological assessment. बेटे, आपको हम एक टास्क दे रहे हैं, ठीक है? ये आप कार्ड देख रहे हैं, इसके ऊपर एक डिज़ाइन बना हुआ है, ये डिज़ाइन है, ठीक है? यहाँ कुछ ब्लॉक्स रखे हैं, इनमें आप देखेंगे एक तरफ पीला है, एक तरफ काला भी है, एक तरफ लाल है, एक तरफ सफ़ेद है। आपको करना ये है कि इस डिज़ाइन को देखते हुए इन ब्लॉक्स को इस डिज़ाइन के हिसाब से जमाना है, ठीक है? हम देखते हैं आप कितने टाइम में कर पाएंगे। चलिए शुरू हो जाइए। थैंक यू, शाबाश। इस पजल में क्या है आप देख रहे हैं? यहाँ आपको एक डिज़ाइन दिख रहा है, यहाँ आपको कुछ ब्लॉक्स दिखाई दे रहे हैं, पर अब ध्यान से आप देखिएगा, जहाँ ब्लॉक्स रखे हुए हैं वहाँ ऊपर एक ब्लू लाइन है और रेड लाइन नीचे है, जबकि आपको इसको इस तरह से अरेंज करना है कि रेड वाला जो है ये ऊपर आ जाए और ब्लू वाला जो है वो नीचे आ जाए। पर अब ध्यान रखिएगा एक बात का, इसमें आप किसी भी ब्लॉक को इस तरफ खिसका सकते हैं, इस तरफ खिसका सकते हैं, ऊपर खिसका सकते हैं, नीचे खिसका सकते हैं, पर किसी ब्लॉक को भी उठा के ऐसे नहीं रख सकते। ध्यान रहेगा? ठीक है, जितनी जल्दी हो सके आप करने की कोशिश करिएगा, पर बिना घबराए। ये डिज़ाइन जो है वो इस प्रकार का रहेगा, ठीक है? चलिए शुरू कर दीजिए। पजल में क्या है, आप देख रहे हैं यहाँ ऐसे 3 डंडे हैं, 2 तो खाली हैं, तीसरे वाले में ये 7 टाइल्स लगे हुए हैं। किस तरह से रखे गए हैं, सबसे बड़ा टाइल सबसे नीचे है, फिर उसके ऊपर उससे छोटा वाला है, उसके ऊपर उससे भी छोटा वाला है और सबसे छोटा ऊपर है। आपको करना ये है कि इन सारे टाइल्स को एक एक करके इस डंडी से लेके इन दोनों में से किसी भी डंडी पे आप ला सकते हैं, पर नियम 2 हैं। नंबर 1, एक टाइम पे आप केवल एक टाइल उठाएंगे, एक से ज़्यादा नहीं। नंबर 2, कभी भी छोटे टाइल के ऊपर बड़ा टाइल नहीं आना चाहिए। ठीक है, समझ गए? ज़रा बताइए क्या करना है आपको।
एक साथ 2 नहीं उठाने और छोटे टाइल के ऊपर बड़ा नहीं आना चाहिए।
कभी भी नहीं आना चाहिए। ठीक है, गलती होती है, आप उसको सुधार सकते हैं। ठीक है, जितने कम मूव्स में आप ये काम कर सकते हैं उतना ही अच्छा है। ठीक है, चलिए शुरू हो जाए। A comment is in order about questionnaires and inventories first. Numerous personality and ability questionnaires have been devised and used in accordance with psychometric principles. We have many more examples of personality inventories in this context. In many questionnaires, the response format is actually a rating scale, an example of a scaling technique. These can be of various kinds, including psychophysical methods. So, for example, a person can be asked how much he or she likes a particular issue, or how much he or she disagrees and agrees with a particular issue. The intensity of agreement or disagreement is to be represented on a quantitative rating scale. We also have performance-based tests. These are typically used in assessing abilities, cognitive processes, and also cognitive style. One example of a cognitive style measure that is based on performance is that of what is called field dependence independence, as shown through hidden figures or embedded figures. An example follows. In this very simple test, the first figure, figure A, is shown to the subject, followed by figure B, which is clearly more complex than figure A. The instruction is that the subject should locate or find figure A in figure B. In other words, the subject has to disembed figure A from the larger, more complex figure B. Techniques which are typically used for personality assessment. These techniques, at least originally, were based on the Freudian defense mechanism known as projection. To a large extent, most researchers agree that projective techniques do tap the defense mechanism called projection. In this set of techniques, the individual sees in another external medium or projects motives and psychological states that are actually present in his or her own unconscious mind, but the subject is not aware of this fact. Accordingly, projective tests assess these motives indirectly by analyzing the individual's responses to stimuli that are structured, for example, pictures, semi-structured, for example, incomplete sentences, or unstructured, for example, ink blots. Some well-known projective tests that belong to these three categories are the thematic apperception test, or TAT, devised by Henry Murray, which is an example of a structured projective test. The rotor incomplete sentence blank, devised by Rotor, is an example of a semi-structured projective test. The Rorschach ink blot, devised by Hermann Rorschach, is an example of an unstructured projective test. Avdeshji, please look at this picture carefully. I would like you to tell a story on this picture. Please indicate what is happening in the picture now, what might have happened earlier, and what is likely to happen in future. Please remember, you are not expected to just describe the picture. Rather, you have to tell a story.
इस समय एक महिला बर्तन में पानी लिए हुए है और दूसरी महिला उस बर्तन को उसके सर पर रखवाने का प्रयास कर रही है। और इसके पहले ये दोनों महिलाएं पानी की खोज के लिए किसी दूसरे स्थान से इस स्थान तक आई, यहाँ पर इनको पानी मिला और बाद में ये दोनों लोग जो है पानी ले करके और वापस अपने जहाँ से घर से आई हों या और जहाँ भी रहती हों वापस जो है ये अपने स्थान पर जाएंगी।
Subhash ji, I'll be showing you this card. Please give the first response that comes to your mind. What do you see in this card?
मैम इसमें एक तो ये दिख रहा है जैसे दो लोग खड़े हैं और ये क्लैप कर रहे हैं, एक तो ये लग रहा है मेरे को, और दूसरा ये लग रहा है जैसे किसी कैट का फेस लग रहा है मेरे को। मैं इसको घुमा कर देख सकता हूँ। इसके अलावा ऐसा लग रहा है जैसे दो एनिमल्स को ऐसे लटका दिया गया उल्टा, उसका सिर वगैरह काट करके।
Projective techniques have been said to have some advantages. For example, projective test responses yield in-depth motivation-related information not usually available in questionnaire responses or in externally observed behavior. The claim is that to a fair extent, difficulties such as response sets or faking often encountered in questionnaires are not encountered in projective test responses. But as one would expect, projective techniques do have their own limitations as well. The analysis of responses to projective tests is highly subjective. These techniques or tests cannot be validated easily, and their reliability is questionable. In other words, it would be difficult to establish that a projective test is standardized in the same sense as a questionnaire would be. We finally come to what are called qualitative techniques. At the very beginning, it should be made clear that qualitative techniques involve a very different approach compared to the quantitative approach. There are many qualitative techniques that are in use now, depending on the researcher's interest and inclination. In contrast to quantitative methods, qualitative research methods provide data that are descriptive and, of course, are non-quantitative. This, however, should not be taken to mean that qualitative techniques can never be used to give explanations of behaviors or phenomena. Several qualitative methods can be used in psychology. The major purpose of the qualitative approach is an interpretativist and constructivist answer to the positivistic approach that dominated psychology and some other social sciences for several decades. What this means is that in contrast to the positivistic or logical positivistic approach that assumes that there is an external reality that can be objectively assessed, the idea behind qualitative techniques is that a researcher should also look quite carefully and closely at how subjects interpret their world and construct their own meanings based on their subjective and personal experiences. The distinctive feature of qualitative research is that it seeks to examine how people make sense of their world and how they themselves assign meaning to their experiences and to various concepts. Qualitative techniques aim at gathering extensive and rich information about a phenomenon that goes beyond constrained quantitative information. This phrase, rich information, is likely to be repeated in our discussion of the various qualitative techniques that are now in use. It is also argued that there are 4 main cognitive processes that are involved in qualitative research. This idea has been proposed by Morse in 1994. The 4 cognitive processes that Morse mentions are comprehending the phenomenon of interest, synthesizing its various expressions, theorizing about these aspects and the phenomenon as a whole, and recontextualizing the obtained information, that is, extending it beyond the context in which the phenomenon was studied. Usually in the qualitative approach, the aim is not to test or verify a particular pre-formulated hypothesis based on existing theories. In general, qualitative research is exploratory, that is, it seeks answers to questions without presupposing specific answers. Interest lies in knowing subjects' own perceptions and not in confirming or testing whether subjects see reality in a particular way that is hypothesized or predicted by the researcher. Information obtained from the subjects is used to understand the phenomena of interest in great detail and in a realistic way. Such information may be used to formulate further hypotheses and eventually to build theories. However, this may not be necessary in all qualitative techniques. Rather, the information obtained through any qualitative technique may stand on its own and add to what is known about various phenomena. Another analogy has been given between the quantitative approach and the qualitative one. The quantitative approach involves, as Everett and Lewis say, inquiry from the outside, whereas the qualitative approach involves inquiry from the inside. Another metaphor in this connection is seeing through a window which is closer to the quantitative approach versus seeing with the help of a lantern which is said to be closer to the qualitative approach. This metaphor has been attributed to Shank in 2002. What this implies is that a quantitative researcher typically is trying to look through the window to see if what is expected is really there. On the other hand, the qualitative researcher is trying to use a lantern to find out what is hidden in those areas that are yet unexplored. Generally, qualitative methods afford greater flexibility than quantitative methods. The psychometric approach is absent in the qualitative approach, and no assumption is made that mental states can necessarily be expressed in terms of numbers or quantity. Qualitative methods would be carried out mostly in the natural setting of the subjects and not in the laboratory or in other artificially created settings. This means that in general, qualitative data would be closer to reality. In addition, as has already been said, qualitative methods provide very rich information and are often crucial for making quantitative data meaningful. Qualitative techniques provide greater challenge in analysis, but it must be admitted that they also introduce greater subjectivity in interpretation. Explanation and prediction that have been designated as the goals of the scientific method thus are likely to get affected in the case of the qualitative methods. Let us now take a look at the commonly used qualitative techniques. It must be made clear at this point that the description that is going to follow is not going to provide us with any final or comprehensive answer to what qualitative research is all about. Rather, it would help us to understand very briefly what is going on in this field called qualitative research. Some of the more commonly used techniques are ethnography, including descriptive, interpretive, as well as critical ethnography. This involves naturalistic and participant observation. In-depth interviews, focus group studies, the diary method, content analysis, narrative analysis, and discourse analysis. Let us begin with ethnography. This term refers to an integrated study of interactions, relationships, beliefs, and behavior in communities and groups. Initially, ethnography was developed and used to study culture, that is, beliefs, practices, and the like in specified cultural groups. Now, the concept of culture itself is taken in a broad sense. It has been extended to the idea of what Whitehead in 2004 calls cultural systems or the cultural systems paradigm. Ethnography may include both qualitative and quantitative methods, but the approach is primarily qualitative. Ethnography is carried out through direct as well as participant observation in natural settings, along with in-depth interviews with individuals as well as focus groups. The information that is gathered may be analyzed using any of the accepted qualitative methods such as content analysis, narrative analysis, and discourse analysis. Ethnography involves a great deal of minute observation, note-taking, and often audio-visual recording although the last is not a necessary component. What should be observed and recorded, and how much of this is accurately done, is often left to the researcher. Since there is observation and data collection in the field on several occasions, the chances of correct note-taking or corrections to be made in note-taking is higher in the case of ethnographic studies. Some qualitative researchers, for example, Reeves, Cooper and Hodges 2008, have specified what they call the dimensions of what is to be observed in ethnography, namely, an act referring to individual actions occurring in a context, activity or specific interrelated acts, actor, the person or persons engaged in the acts or activities, event constituted of various activities in that context, time referring to the sequence of these activities, space referring to the physical aspects of the setting, objects or the things present in the setting, goal or what the actors are planning to attain, and feelings, the emotional states experienced by the people in that context. Taking a look at in-depth interviews, it appears that interviews are a spontaneous way of collecting qualitative data. The idea is that there could be no better way of finding out what is happening on a scene other than asking people what they are experiencing or getting specific information from them. An interview, as well as an in-depth interview, basically involves holding purposeful conversations and dialogues with individuals or with focus groups. Jennifer Mason, 1996, says, "Good qualitative interviewing is hard, creative work. It involves planning, and several steps and components have to be kept in mind. In in-depth interviewing, there is questions that aim at obtaining detailed and minute information about specific topics, but typically a small number of participants or subjects are involved in in-depth interviewing. This information that is obtained through in-depth interviewing would not be available through other methods such as questionnaires or even observation of externally expressed behavior. The information obtained through such interviews may be personal, and therefore such data should be handled very carefully, keeping in mind the privacy and other ethical aspects of the subjects in question. What is involved in planning for an interview, especially an in-depth interview? Some researchers have listed the following. First, the aspect or aspects of behavior that have to be covered, the sample, namely who is to be interviewed, the specific questions to be asked, and a particular eye has to be kept on sensitive questions that may not be answered directly by the subject because there is something very personal about such questions. The sequence of these questions. There should be genuine listening on the part of the interviewer. A balance has to be maintained between talking and listening, although it is always recommended that for a successful interview, there should be more listening than talking. Note-taking and observing nonverbal behavior, which requires quite a bit of skill. Remembering whatever cannot be recorded for various practical reasons, and keeping the interviewer's biases out of the picture so that the data that is gathered does not get unduly affected by such biases. Focus group studies have also come into the picture in a big way. This method involves the study of a small group of individuals with respect to the topic of interest to the researcher. It should be kept in mind that focus group studies are not the same as group interviews. The group in such a case is the equivalent of individual interviews. In the focus group, on the other hand, the members interact with each other and also with the interviewer, providing detailed information about the topic of interest. Focus groups require noting of verbal information, non-verbal behaviors, and also interactions while the focus group is being observed and interviewed. The interviewer usually acts as the moderator of the group discussion and is not typically a participant in this group discussion. There also could be some variations in the focus group method. For example, there may be 2 rather than 1 moderators, and this would be in order to provide the other point of view. For example, there could be a debate on which focus groups discuss and see points of agreement or disagreement. There could be one moderator who presents one side of the debate and another moderator who presents the other side of the debate. It should be kept in mind that both of these moderators are actually the researchers. The next method under the qualitative research approach is the diary method. This method involves recording of personal experiences, including emotional and other reactions. Both the researcher and the subject can maintain diaries. Accounts can be written daily or at specified intervals and later analyzed. Often, subjects are put through specific experiences and are asked to maintain diaries. Content analysis and textual analysis are methods that can be used in both qualitative and quantitative research. Content analysis involves examining and recording the core themes or ideas contained in texts, written or spoken responses to open-ended questions in questionnaires or interviews, any text in mass media, advertisements, literary texts, and the like. The themes or ideas identified in the content are taken as indicators of meanings construed by the subjects rather than as objective facts. Different forms of content analysis have been used, as proposed by C.A. and Shannon in 2005. 3 kinds of content analysis have been specified by these authors: conventional, which involves categorizing of various themes from the raw textual data. No prior categories are used. Directed, which entails predefined categories drawn from relevant theories. And summated, which involves identifying themes and recording their frequencies. Next, we turn attention to narrative analysis, which is not only very common in qualitative research now, but is also with a degree of difficulty to be taken with a big pinch of salt. A narrative is defined by Ox and Capps in 2001 as a coherent temporal progression of events that may be reordered, a plot line that encompasses a beginning, a middle, and an end, conveys a particular perspective, and is designed for a particular audience who apprehend and shape its meaning. These ideas may not be very easy to take in at one go, but what we have to understand here is that the basic premise in narrative analysis is as follows. There may not be something like external social reality that is or should be seen in the same way by everyone. Instead, social reality is what is construed by people in terms of their own experiences. But probably what is more central to the idea of narratives is that these experiences that individuals have, cast into a story or narrative form, yield very rich information about human behavior and experience that is not available in any of the other methods, especially the quantitative ones. What has to be kept in mind is that although narratives involve stories, and narrative analysis accordingly involves analysis of these stories, one may be a little suspicious or doubtful about its value as a scientific method if the definition of being scientific assumes objectivity. But if we do not subscribe to objectivity as the only or necessary criterion of any intellectual inquiry, then narrative analysis is a very good way of delving into the depths of what a person thinks about in terms of reality as defined by himself or herself. When analyzing narratives from different subjects or participants, an attempt is made to identify unique features in the narrative as well as common themes and patterns across different subjects. Many narratives have to be analyzed before a meaningful set of conclusions can be drawn. Narratives may be analyzed in terms of scripts, which are frames for cultural analysis, stories that may contain an evaluative components. Scripts are used as frames for cultural analysis, and stories that contain an evaluative component also provide information partly from the point of view of culture, but also from the point of view of the personal experiences of individuals. Patterns are a term that refer to ideas or concepts that recur in narratives. Themes refer to collection of patterns. Temporal sequence refers to the order in which events or experiences are narratives. These are bases on which narratives may be coded and analyzed. Discourse analysis, which follows the set of analytical techniques, namely content analysis and narrative analysis, is another form of qualitative research which has added not just wealth or breadth to what we know about human behavior and phenomena, but has also taken on some new dimensions that are missing in the quantitative approach. Discourse means communicating or conveying thoughts and ideas through words or other media. It also refers to conversation. As a qualitative research tool and approach, discourse analysis, like content and narrative analysis, has brought out many intricate and hidden aspects of how people make sense of their world and how they construe reality. There are several schools of thought in discourse analysis. Not all of them are directly applied to the fields of psychology, and in fact, many of them are more relevant to areas such as linguistics, sociology, and philosophy. We will not be talking about these different schools of thought in the present context. When used in psychology, discourse analysis can very usefully bring out how people use language to express not merely their personal views, but also how they interpret them. Analyzing discourses in different contexts with the same participants or with different participants in similar contexts provides information that makes it possible to find wider explanations for many psychological phenomena. One major feature of discourse analysis is the use of language as a basis of discourse. This allows amply for the analysis of other forms of discourses, that is, other than interpersonal conversations. So, for example, in literature, film and other media, discourse analysis can act as a powerful tool. Finally, we look briefly at some major considerations in methods of psychology. The ethical aspects are one component that are absolutely necessary in order to preserve the participants' dignity, freedom and privacy. The general rule, which need not be written anywhere but has to be followed very strictly, is that any procedure that is likely to impinge on the individual's privacy or sense of freedom must be followed only after the informed consent of the participants. A second consideration in the methods used in psychology is the generalizability of findings. This involves questions related to sample aspects and the representativeness of the contexts that are studied. The goals of the scientific method, namely understanding and explaining phenomena and predicting behavior on the basis of this understanding and explanation, are goals that have been questioned in the post-positivistic phase. It should be acknowledged here that although many of the quantitative methods claim that they help in understanding, explaining and predicting events and phenomena in an objective way, the same kind of reasoning can at least partly be applied to the qualitative approach as well. The next consideration is that of objectivity and subjectivity. And by this stage in our discussion, it should be very clear that both of these are difficult to define. The claim that quantitative approaches make for objectivity may not always be sustained. As for the subjectivity that is found very clearly in the qualitative approach, one can only say that this subjectivity is perhaps the source of the richness that it adds to the information we have about human beings in general. In this context, a comment has to be made about what Cronbach said in 1957 regarding the two scientific disciplines within psychology. He was, of course, talking mainly about the quantitative approach, referring to the experimental and correlational approaches. He pointed out that it was important to be very cautious about the use of these two approaches. He described the experimental approach as the tight little island which does not allow much flexibility and makes claims about studying behavior under controlled conditions. By contrast, he described the correlational approach as the Holy Roman Empire, which believes that all the states that belong to this empire, all the techniques that are included in the correlational approach are very holy in the sense that they cannot be questioned. Both of these approaches have their flaws and limitations, and there is a need to integrate them. Although Cronbach made this observation many decades ago, it is now accepted that the integration not merely between these two scientific disciplines, but also between the qualitative approach which is coming in now and the quantitative approach that has dominated psychology for so many years, have to be brought together in an appropriate fashion. All this goes to tell us that it is ultimately the multi-method approach rather than a single technique or approach that is going to help us in understanding, explaining and predicting behavior as would be the goal of the scientific approach. The case study method or approach brings in a good combination of information about individuals or groups in such a way that we get maximum information about that particular individual or a particular group without quarreling or debating the reality or the objectivity of qualitative and quantitative approaches. Ultimately, therefore, if the science of psychology is to proceed on the right track. It is now time that we understand that a good combination of the qualitative as well as the quantitative approach is what will allow us to attain that goal. On this note, we conclude our discussion of methods of psychology. Thank you.